Okay. There we go. Yup, wrong one. That's better. There we go. Do a quick screen switch. And there we go. Okay, welcome back. It's glad to have you here. And as you can see, we're going to be continuing on with some more North of the Border videos. 199 videos. Jesus. Well, then again, this guy actually makes, actual real content, not like what I do. I just make React videos and stuff. React streams, and this guy does a lot better. By actually making, real content. Okay, let's see if we can find the... Where is that one with the... 1 year? I'm looking for that... you know what, never mind. We'll go back up to... Yeah. Let's go all the way back up to the top and actually... pick this one?
Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy
Hold on.
things. And with the release of Space Marine 2, it seems every YouTuber out there is getting their very own Space Marine statue. So imagine my excitement when what should arrive in the mail, but nothing, because nobody done sent me nothing. That's okay though, because I made my own. What my Space Marine is missing though is a proper baddie to fight. Well, one that's alive, at least. So let's do that. And in keeping with the Space Marine 2 algorithmic draw, I figured why not make a big spooky sword-armed Tyranid. So once I've got a pre-prepared armature popped into my block and balanced, I can start to figure out the pose and scale. Now I want this model to fit the scale of Bob the Space Marine, but I'm also limited by the size of my oven, which means I need to get a little creative in how I design this particular beastie. More than anything, it's going to mean Barbara's body's going to have to be built in sections and assembled at the end. For now, I'll start by building up the torso, tail, and legs, covering the armature in a thick layer of aluminium foil. Once the body's been beefed up, I can start to slap on an even thicker layer of clay. Now, normally I'd like to keep this layer of clay light, opting to bulk out the majority of the body with foil since it's quite a bit cheaper, but I know I'm going to be carving great swaths of clay away to create the various trypophobia-inducing detail, so I'm going to need an extra thick body layer to begin with. With the initial layer of clay smoothed and blended in to remove the seams and joints, I can start to refine the detail, adding more chunky blobs of clay wherever I need. In particular, the Tyranid warrior seems to be a touch top-heavy with a big old bony carapace covering the entirety of its chest, so I'll thicken up the midsection with an extra thick clay wrap. Then once I've added some bony carapace underwear, I can start to flatten the bony bits so they're a little less rounded and a bit more refined. Before I get to adding that surface detail though, I want to pop the head in place so I can get an idea of the scale. I've made an initial peanut-shaped head shape to fit on top and add onto to create an appropriately sized cranium, and I'll add the bottom jaw and carve out a mouth before adding little bits and bobs around the face to alter the shape just enough so that it doesn't infringe on any existing xenomorph intellectual property. And then I guess for some reason, before I add more facial detail, I'll carve away some more of the clay on the torso as well as add the quintet of shoulder sockets for future arms. With that quick detour done though, I can go back to the head and smoosh some pre-baked teeth in place before getting to work marking out the various goopy eye bits and other semi-random seeming facial details. Barbara's jaw was a bit too big, so I'll slim that down before cutting away at her cheeks to turn the smooth, appealing surface into a scarred, goopy, unappealing surface. Then I'll do the same to the back of her head before cutting the whole thing off and setting it aside for later. Then once I've re-stumped her neck stump, I can start adding all that aforementioned bony carapacey detail. I'll start by scooping away the majority of the clay with some sculpting hooks to create the initial scooped out look, using larger hooks for the larger bits and smaller hooks for the smaller bits. But bear with me, it's pretty complicated stuff. For the smaller speed holes, I'll use some small ball styluses of varying sizes to poke holes of varying sizes, then I'll come back with some soft silicone brushes to blend the sharper edges together. Then it's back to the ball styluses to add some more detail on the inside. Now I don't really know what I'm doing at this point, so I'm just trying to make it look kinda organic, which usually involves smoothing sharp edges and adding weird undefinable surface details. Once those undefinable surface details have been defined, I can start to carve out each of the individual sections, creating a sort of rib cage appearance. Again, I'm not wholly sure what's going on here, but I think it's starting to look kinda okay, which is really what I'm going for, sculptural mediocrity. I'll then break out some even tinier ball styluses and add some even tinier tail holes. Otherwise, at this point, we're well and truly on to the trypophobia portion of the build. I'll work my way around Babs' body, poking little holes into all the gaps in the ribs and bony bits to create the plethora of what I can only assume are breathing holes or alien exhaust ports. For the knees and ankle joints, I'll cut some steps in it to create the exposed noodly tendon underneath. Then I can work my way around the rest of the legs, poking and prodding until everything looks alien. I don't know how else to describe it, but if you googled creepy alien texture, you're probably going to get something sort of akin to this. Once the larger sections are finished, I can then start to add the finer detail within the detail, adding lumps and bumps as well as those aforementioned noodly knee tendons. Her feet are basically just creepy alien hooves, so I'll slap a blob onto the bottoms of the legs and cut away the excess until I've got a nice smooth flat surface that I can then texturize and add some extra little bits and pieces to make them look appropriately alien-y. Appropriately alien-y. A couple quintessential back of the leg talons can get added to the back of the leg and blended in, then some final surface texturing, and I'm ready to pop her freshly baked head back onto the torso. However, I know for a fact that her head, once adorned with a spooky alien crown, won't fit in my oven, so I need to know I can easily remove her head after the body's been baked. And to do that, I'm going to use some water-based separator. This stuff creates a barrier between the cured and uncured clay, meaning I can blend the two sections together, then once they've been baked in the oven, they should separate nice and easy. With that in place, I can take the time to blend the neck into the head and freshen up her neck holes. Otherwise, that's the body mostly finished, but before I bake it, I want to give it a full once-over with isopropyl alcohol. This will soften up the topmost layer of clay, allowing me to blend the sharper edges together to create a softer, more organic look. Additionally, by stippling the soft, goopy clay with a brush, I can create a terrific bony texture that you won't even notice once I've added several layers of paint. With that though, Babs' body is done and ready for its first bake. And once it's out of the oven and cooled down, I can pop her head off and set it aside again while I get to work making her arms. I'll start by drilling 2 holes into each of the sockets. Now the double holes mean that my arms won't be spinning around while I'm working on them, and I've pre-baked some balls onto the tips of some extra long armature arms that I can then fit neatly into my freshly drilled shoulders. I'll then reposition said armature arms into an appropriately spooky pose, then I can start the enclaying process, covering the arms in clay and refining the shape until they vaguely resemble the look of the legs. I'll do the same thing to all 4 arms at the same time to make sure they're all scaled appropriately to one another, then once the shapes are in place, I can start adding the same goopy alien texture that the legs have. I don't actually own any Tyranid models, so I'm basing the texture and design on the spinnable model you can see on the Warhammer website, so if it doesn't exactly match what you expect, then I can only apologize. Otherwise, those freshly sculpted arms will get the same alcohol spritzing to soften the sharpness, and I can toss it all into the oven to bake while I get to work making the weapons. I decided from the outset that I wanted to give Babs 2 big top arm size and 2 equally big alien swords, so I'll make the initial scythe shape by eyeballing it, but the sword shape I planned out with a piece of paper first to ensure that the shape was repeatable. I'll press that piece of paper onto a sheet of clay and cut away the excess until I've got a kinda wonky looking extra thick LARP safe sword. I'll then repeat this process to get me a second scythe and a second sword, then it's into the oven to bake so they're nice and hard. Once they've been freed from their black baking tray prison, I'll drill a couple holes into the bottoms to make mounting easier later, and it's on to the ensharpening process. I made the weapons out of Super Sculpey instead of Cosclay since it's a lot stiffer once it's been baked, and it takes sanding a lot nicer, leaving a sharper, cleaner edge. Once I've cut away the edge until it's kinda beveled, I can work my way through a series of higher grit sandpapers, folded and wrapped around various tools until my sais and swords are looking a little more deadly. Once sanded, the swords need a few extra holes drilled carefully using a nice sharp bit, then I'll use my scalpel to cut some battle damage and chips into the blades. To mount the blades onto the arms, I'll cut away the majority of the remaining armature wire and unwind the helix, which will leave me with a single strand that I can then stick into the bottom of the blade. I'll then coat the exposed wire in a thick layer of Bacon Bond, and I can start to build up the hand blobby clay thing that attaches the scythe to the arm. Mostly it's just a bunch of goopy lumpy bits that vaguely resemble a hand with a weird looking thumb on top tipped with another big claw. This lumpy hand thing gets lots of the same ugly alien texturing as the rest of the limbs, and I can add the glowing green poison sac to the underside. At least I assume that's what it is, and at this point I'm too scared to look it up. Otherwise, the little eventually glowy green balls in place, that's the scythe hand finished, so it's on to the sword hand. The sword hand is an actual hand holding the sword, but the sword's also like growing out of the arm or something. At any rate, I've drilled a hole in the forearm so I can fit a length of wire down and around the hilt that's also the hilt itself, and I'll wrap this in a thin layer of clay and smooth that out. The sword hilt arm handle thing gets a little glowy, eventually green growth attached to the underside as well, and I can start to wrap some fingers around the handle. I made these by rolling some little wormy dealies into points with knuckles that I can then attach into the appropriate positioned positions. Final thumb goes around the top, then I can smooth and blend it all together, adding the ever-important creepy alien texture on top. I'll then repeat all these steps again to make the other two arms before baking them so I can finally attach them to Babs's body. And with the arms in place, I can finally get to work making the chitinous armor plates on Babs's back and legs. I'll start by applying a thick layer of Bacon Bond to help the next layer of clay adhere, then I can slap a semi-thick sheet of clay onto Barbara's back and cut it to size. Then using the flat of a tool, I'll mark out the location of each of the chitinous plates so that they layer one on top of the other and cut away the excess around the edges before working my tools back and forth towards the center to get the general shape shaped out. Once they've been adequately smoothed, I can add the knob to the tops of the three topmost plates, then using a couple different silicone brushes, I can start to add the texture to the tops of said plates. The plates that cover Babs' upper torso stick out a bit more, so I'll first create a riser out of aluminum foil sandwiched between layers of clay that I can then pop a larger sheet on top of. I then cut said sheet to shape, added the appropriate plate sections to the backside, then textured the same way I textured the tail plates. Except I did most of this off camera, not realizing I was recording the blank back wall. The leg armor undergoes a pretty much identical process of attaching a sheet and cutting plates into the surface before texturing it accordingly. Everything then gets a once-over with alcohol and a brush to clean it up and make it look a little more organic, and it's into the oven to bake while I get to work finally finishing the head. I'll drill a little hole into the top of the head so I can fit a little length of armature wire that I folded back on itself to create a T. This T can then be bent to make a slightly curved T, and I can lay down a layer of clay before adding another piece of wire that points directly backwards. Because Barbara's sporting a fashionable full head crown, I need some way to support it while it bakes, so this armature wire will serve just that purpose. I'll cover the wire in an initial layer of clay before attaching a larger full-length sheet to the top of Barbara's head. I can then blend this into the existing supporting clay horns, and I can start to refine the shape and add the various chitinous plates.
Definitely a high-grade Tyranid.
Some deeper grooving will separate those plates and make them look like they're layered one on top of the other, and I can add the last little bit of surface texturing to match the rest of the body. Then, after a little alcohol-related smoothing, that's the head finished, which means Barbara's sculpting phase is finally finished. What she really needs now is a bit of color. Unfortunately for her, though, she's mostly white. Which means it's time for the airbrush. Painting white can be a bit of a ball ache, especially when you're trying to get into some of these hard-to-reach places, but the airbrush makes pretty quick work of it, and it should help me lay down a nice solid white layer on all the parts that I need to be a lighter color. Now, I think Babs' body is mostly a bone-like substance, but the white's a bit too white, so before I start adding the smaller details, I'll tint all the white with a sort of dirty sepia wash that's super thinned down. I only want to stain the white rather than paint the whole model beige. With the white in place and the sepia wash not even close to dry, I'll really highlight my impatience by starting to add all the red to the inside of each of the trypophobia traps, as well as basically any of the non-smooth surface details that are scattered all over Babs' body. I'll then follow that up with a darker red wash to add some shading to each of the enreddened sections. This time I will set it aside to dry though, before returning with a bit of white on a sponge to clean up the overspill and soften the edges between the red and the white. Finally, for the final highlights, I'll tickle the tips of the larger red sections with a whitish red glaze before stippling some white over the larger white sections to add that final bit of stipply texture.
Very pale.
Then it's on to the darker bits of Babs, starting with the chitinous plates that get a nearly black purple base coat followed by some lighter purple glazes around the edge to add a barely perceptible gradient. I'll then follow this up with an even lighter purple, aggressively dry brush towards the center of each plate, before working my way towards an almost pinkish purple applied sparingly in the same manner and a final edge highlighting around the edge to add that final edge highlighting. I can then paint Babs' eyes with an initial yellow followed by some black around the edge to make the eyes a little more spooky, and I can base coat the teeth with black, then add some white glazes to bring the white back with a darker black around the base of the tooth. Finally, for a little color variation, and because I thought it might look nice, I added a tiny bit of sandy beige to the tips of her cranial ridges. Onto the arms, I'll give each of the blades a base coat in a deep dark red, then using my airbrush again, I'll create a soft gradient towards the tip with a much brighter blood red. I'll then take the brightest red I have and add some fine edge highlights around the edges of the blades to make them look a little less rounded. Those green glowy bits finally get that green glowy coloring by way of fluorescent green with a darker green edge highlight, and I can finally assemble Barbara's final, fully built, fully painted form. And I have to say she's looking pretty smart, but she is missing one thing: a big, goopy, gross, pointy tongue, which I made off camera because up until now I'd forgotten I had to make one. Otherwise, with that, Barbara is finally finished, so all that's left to do is make her something to stand on.
And some saliva.
I figured at this point the video is edging ever closer to that 20-minute mark and I'm getting really tired of talking, so I'm gonna make a pretty basic base.
Z. Hey, thank you. Glad to have you here, mate. Jesus Christ, you scared me. Yeah, handcrafted Tyranid army. That would be pretty interesting for a tabletop. Like, you can just make, like, your own personal battleground areas, like something based on Graia or something.
Even better, I want that base to match the Space Marine base, so I'll build a blocky rocky outcropping out of some extra thick foam. Once I've got the basic base shape cut out, I can start to chop bits off until it's a haphazard geometric shape, at which point I can use everyone's favorite texturing tool, a couple of rocks.
Rocky.
The idea is that it's sort of a war-torn cityscape, so we'll add some cracks in the top, then scatter some little bits of rubble around the base and stick some armature wire into the sides to act as exposed rebar before covering the rest of the base in some
like
varying
Graia
sizes of
or
rock,
Kajaku.
sand, and little bits of leftover plaster. A quick spritz of isopropyl alcohol followed by a heavy dousing with watered-down PVA.
You what? You what? You've been in some of my streams?
glue will lock
Okay, well, yeah, so keep enjoying.
everything in place, and once that's had a chance to dry, I can top coat it with a black paint and PVA glue mix, followed by a series of very heavy gray dry brushings of varying shades. The exposed rebar I'll paint with a couple coats of rusty looking rust paint to make them look rusty, and I can finally fit Babs in place. She is, however, looking a little too clean, so to help her blend in a bit more and make it look like she's been up to no good, I'll use some black and gray pigment powder scattered around the top of the base and the bottoms of her legs. This should help to blend the two opposing shades in and make it look a little bit more like she's part of the scene. Finally, all that white is begging for a bit of gore, so I'll mix up some watery blood red wash and flick it haphazardly all over the top of the base and somewhat sparingly around Babs' body. I'm also going to make sure her swords are well saturated, and I'll add some blood spatters up her chest where some unfortunate guardsmen probably met their fate. Last but not least, I'll give her mouth and eyes a once-over with a high-gloss varnish to make them nice and goopy before deciding to do the same thing to all the red bits around her body. I don't know if they'd be goopy or not, but I think it helps to add some extra vibrancy to the otherwise kind of flat-looking coloring. All I need to do then is add some extra stringy, extra goopy, transparent glue around her tongue and mouth, and that's us done here and on to the glamour shots.
What is this song? I wonder if North of the Border could probably do like a Transformers kind of figurine like he does in Megatron.
As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them, freshly baked baby, happy anniversary, future wifey staff with the proper North of the Border. You do you, and you do what makes you happy. And hey, if liking this video makes you happy, then who am I to get in the way of that? Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Is that an Imperial Fist Space Marine? Okay. Now, do we have a link to the... Yep, there it is. No, wait, that's Space Marine. Where's the Space Marine? Oh, there it is. I made a massive Space Marine from a block of clay. 11 months ago. No, YouTube.
Hi folks, my name
YouTube not wanting this. Dang ad blockers. Like, I don't want ads, man.
is Adam, and I like to make tiny nerdy things, but sometimes I kinda wish these tiny nerdy things were slightly larger. I could of course just get something already made shipped straight to my door, but why would I spend almost 20 Great British dollary dues to buy it when I can spend well over 10 times that amount in materials and around 2 weeks of my life to make a slightly inferior version of my own? Now, I happen to think the best copycat creations are less functional and more fragile, so I'll of course be making my massive Space Marine out of clay, which means I need to give him an all-aluminium armature skeleton. So once I've marked out where his bones and joints will be, I'll snip off some lengths of wire that I can bend into shape to be his torso and legs. However, this beefy space boy is going to be pretty top-heavy, so he's going to need some impressively thick bones to match his impressively thick frame. This wire takes a bit more work to bend into shape, but it should be a lot less likely to bend under the weight of all that clay, which means after 40 hours of sculpting there will, hopefully, be a slightly reduced chance of my chonky space boy breaking his bones. Otherwise, now that his hardy aluminium underbody is built, I'll bulk out the chest with a bit of aluminium foil before mounting him on a wooden block. Unlike the cheap and cheerful plastic Space Marine, my Astartes is going to be stuck in a single pose, which means I need to figure out an adequately heroic position. I eventually settled on a Captain Morgan pose since it's hella heroic, and then I vacillated between which
Only while he's wielding a bolter.
arm is up and which is down, before eventually deciding he'll be holding a bolter in his right and a chainsword in his left. I then summoned my reference photo from the warp and made sure my proportions were at least accurate so far before getting on to building up the initial layering. Every Space Marine wears a form-fitting black bodysuit under his armor made of copious noodles wrapped lovingly around his torso. However, the majority of this will be hidden by the future armor plates. To that end, once I've built up Bob's underlying noodly bodysuit, I'll smooth it all flat and cut and carve the noodles into his knees, hips, and torso, leaving everything else smooth since those will be the only parts that are visible. A combination of flat knives and soft clay shapers will create the necessary noodly bits, and a once-over with a heavy, healthy dosing of isopropyl alcohol will make sure everything is nice and
This is making me want to rewatch that video by that doctor, the one that did that series on what kind of modern medical techniques could be used to create a modern Space Marine. Although, the only reason why is because he shouted, "I am the, woman thing." I'm not saying that live on Twitch. Nope. He shouted it out like it was a battle cry. Funny.
smooth. Then it's into the oven to bake so I don't smoosh my wormy under armor as I build up the rest of the body. Now, normally in the far future of the 41st millennium, everyone seems to be standing on tactical rocks, but I have something better planned. However, for the time being, I need something for Bob to rest his left foot on, so I'll attach a little block to the big block and begin building out his boots. With the base layer of the boots done, I can add his upper leg plates, which I'll make by rolling a thickest sheet of clay through my pasta machine and cutting it to size on his thighs. At this scale, there's a lot of opportunity to increase the amount of detail visible since the model is significantly larger, but I wanted to stick to the original design, so I'm going to keep the greeblies and whatnot to a minimum. This is, of course, based entirely on artistic integrity and respecting the work of the original sculptors, and not because I'm lazy and didn't want to add all sorts of extra work for myself. Otherwise, once the armor's been baked again, I'll crack out my sanding sticks and make sure I've got a nice smooth surface. This is very much a recurring theme here, even if I don't show it, but basically every time I've added another layer of armor plates, I've baked it and sanded it nice and flat. Now with my boots in place and my surface as smooth as I can be bothered to make it, I can begin to build out the next layer of armor plating. I really wasn't sure when I started the sculpture how much work would be involved, but apart from it taking an extra week to put together, the actual process was pretty easy since a Space Marine's armor is just plates on plates on plates. If you're careful and at least think a little bit ahead, you can safely bake each section between parts without fear of messing something up later. What makes it even easier is each section of the body is separated by a black noodly Under Armour gap, which means you never really have to worry about blending sections together. Now, as far as my sculpture is concerned, once I'd added the oversized ankle gonads, I can give Bob a much needed armored banana hammock before getting to work building up his great big Space Marine boots. This was probably the trickiest part to make, but I ended up using my clay as a transfer so I could make a plastic stencil that I could then use to make two identical plates for the boots. With the knee-high boots in place, I can refine the shape while on the model, then mark out the space for future knee nuts before baking it and sanding it like always. Once it's nice and smooth, I can add those aforementioned knee balls and make sure they're nice and round. With that, the lower half of the body is all but finished, so I can get to work fine-tuning his torso. I'll start by adding some initial belly and back plates before adding a substantial amount of clay on top to build up his chest and shoulders and upper back. I want to build his torso in its entirety before I add the arms, so I'm going to take a page out of the miniatures and leave the sides of the torso slightly indented, which should make it easy to add some noodly under armor later. Using my biggest little cookie cutter, I'll cut a big hole in the top of his torso and hollow it out before adding another thin layer of clay on top to add that final layer of upper body armor. His back is a bit thicker to allow for his Space Marine backpack, so I'll thicken that up with a thick sheet of clay cut to size and blend it in before returning to his top torso hole and adding an oversized courgette, which I believe in America is called a zucchini. Some final strips of clay poked with the flat of a scalpel blade will be the random back greeblies, and I can add his teeny tiny backpack that will eventually hold his great big portable generator. Otherwise, I can give him a nice thick belt looped around his waist and a fancy little Space Marine buckle. Finally, with the belt in place, I can add his butt flaps and skirt plates. Those then are the final pieces for his torso, which means the only thing left to do, apart from everything else, is add his arms. These, much like the legs, are mostly black noodles cupped in armor plates, so I'll start by covering the wire in clay and cutting lots of little noodles into the joints. Then once it's been baked, I can add some more armor plates and cut them into the correct shape as well. I'll make some little shoulder plates to be covered in oversized plates later, then I can cover his elbows with some nice thick elbow pads. Speaking of thick, his boots are a bit thin, so I'll pop them off the block and add some thick sheets of clay to the undersides of his boots, and once they've been cut to size and baked, I can cut and sand them until Bob's boots have some nice high quality Heretic stomping treads. Finally, for a final bit of bodywork, I thought his torso was a bit naked, so I decided to add the Emperor's Aquila to that great big blank space on his chest. Also, it's important to remember that in the 41st millennium, even the good guys are bad guys, so instead of the Emperor's double-headed eagle, I'm gonna put a skull in the middle, which, according to Google, makes it an Imperialis.
Are we the baddies?
Regardless, with that little bit of nomenclature out of the way, that's Bob's body built to the best of my abilities, so it's time to make a head. Of course, given that this is a Space Marine, why would I make a head when I can make a helmet? I'll start with a little ball of aluminium covered in clay and baked to give me a nice firm surface to work on. I'll then drape this in a thin sheet of clay and squish it flat before cutting away the section for the faceplate. I'll add a tiny bit of clay on top so I can build up the mouth and nose grill, then add some eyes before spending a frustrating amount of time smoothing the surface out so I can chop the chin off and poke some slanted breathing slits into the front. I'll add some blocky bits onto the sides, then shape them into little metal ears before adding the Space Marine mohawk on top and the back of the head banding around the bottom. Some final greeblies around the sides of the faceplate will give me a place to fit a couple of pipes, and I can bake the head and stick it onto an extra long neck noodle that I'll then cut more of those little black Under Armour noodles onto. Once this is baked, I can cut the neck free and squish it onto the upper torso hole, which I have filled with some fresh clay, leaving the neck behind and the head free to be removed for painting. I'll add a bit of detail inside the gorget, but that's the helmet otherwise finished, so it's time to make some hilariously oversized shoulder pads. These need to be relatively thin and uniformly curved, so I'm going to smoosh up some aluminium foil and round the surface so I have a form that I can build my Space Marine pauldrons on top of. I baked the shoulder pads once to cure the top clay, then filled the interior with some Super Sculpey so it's got less flex. Then I can whip out my sandpaper and make sweet, sweet music. A long wormy dealy wrapped around the edge and smoothed over the side will give me a clean surface that I can cut the little slits into. Then it's back to the sandpaper to make all the surfaces nice and flat and smooth before cutting some long, thin strips of clay to wrap around the edge of the shoulder pad to make the trim. I'll then repeat these steps again to make the other pad, and it's time to make his backpack. I'll start with an extra thick slab of gray clay that my camera has decided is impossible to focus on, then I'll chop all four sides square, then taper the bottom half downwards and cut the sides into a flat bottomed arrow before baking it again and covering it in a very thin sheet that I'll cut ever so slightly undersized. Then it's just a case of cutting some vents into the bottom section before building up the roundy looking bits by layering up a circle and some other circly bits that then get covered in another thicker circle that then gets rounded smooth. This then gets little circles cut out of it before even little circles will fill the empty space. A couple more circles will get stuck to the side and I can fit a big old cylinder on top and blend it in so it's slightly overhanging. This will then give me some space to stick a couple little lengths of wire into, which I'll use to stick some little circles onto, followed by flattened balls. All this gets blended together and I'll drape another sheet with a circle cut out of it over top and blend that in to create a bit more of the shape I want before adding some circles to my balls and carving some grills into them. Finally, I'll wrap the grills in some more circles and add a bunch of greeblies along the blank spaces and stick some pre-baked side vents onto the bottom of the backpack. Otherwise, we're done here, so it's time to make some weapons. And hands, I guess. I'll start with the left hand, which will be holding a chainsword, and to make the blade of my chainsword, I've cut a thin strip of clay into which I can cut some equally sized spaces. I'll then work my way back and forth with clay shapers to smooth the points into teeth, then bake it so I can peel it off and sand the sides flat with a rounded file until the teeth are pointed towards the middle. I'll then sandwich the blade between a sheet of clay and cut away the excess, leaving the teeth exposed. Though this is more of a hot dog than a sandwich, so I guess let me know in the comments below if you think a hot dog is a sandwich. Otherwise, I'll drill a hole into the bottom of the hot dog sword so I can fit a length of wire that I'll wrap in clay to make my handle, which I'll then cover in semi-random greeblies. To make the hand itself, I'll mash a mitten of clay onto the clay handle and wrap it around until I've got a good grip before carving the fingers into it and adding the thumb. I'll then wrap the wrist and palm in plenty of Under Armour noodles before building a guard out of stir sticks wrapped in clay. Finally, a little gray donut can get smooshed onto the flat of the wrist. By wrapping Bob's arm nub in a little bit of cling film, I can then press this clay donut onto the exposed arm bone and fit the hand in place without worrying about the clay adhering. This way I can remove it and paint it at my leisure. To make Bob's bolter, I've printed out a little bolter template that I'll use to cut a relatively thick slab of clay into the appropriate shape before baking it and sanding it smooth. I'll then drill a little hole to fit a wire handle that will get wrapped in clay to become the grip. I'll then press the bolter onto a thin sheet of clay and cut it so it's flush with the top and front of the gun before carving away bits and pieces until I've got an appropriately cool looking bolter profile. I've wrapped a bit of dowel in some clay to make the barrel, and I've made a curved magazine that can get added onto the bottom before adding a couple more odds and ends to finish off the body. The hand can get attached in much the same way as I did with the sword, except the index finger will be extended onto the trigger, which I'll forget to add, so you'll have to use your imagination. At least I remembered the trigger guard. Now all good bolters need a little embellishment, so I've made another flying skull, but this time it's facing forward so Bob knows which way the bullets go when he pulls the trigger. However, at this point I was well and done making wings, so I opted to add a little banner to the other side. Otherwise, that's the final finishing touches finished for the firearm, and I can stick it onto Bob's other arm. I want to be able to remove the hands to paint the weapons, but I don't want there to be a gap, so I'm going to build up the forearm a tiny bit and make the connections as smooth as possible between the wrist donut and the arm nub. Then I can cover it all in greeblies to hide any imperfections. Finally, to affix the backpack, I'm going to pay fan service to you miniature builders and add magnets so I can add and remove the backpack whenever I want. With that, Bob is completely finished and I can fully assemble this beautiful space boy. Of course, while he's looking pretty darn good, he might be looking a little too good, so I'm going to start chopping away. In the 41st millennium, there is only war, so why do all these space marines look so damn pristine? I like my guys to look like they've been to hell and, well, not quite back yet. To that end, I'm going to strategically poke and prod and chop and hack until Bob's body is incredibly well worn. Finally, Bob is finished, but before I can get to the painting, I need to make him a pedestal. And what better pedestal for a space fascist to stand on than the corpse of a Xenos? Orcs, of course, play a prominent role in the 41st millennium, and for my part, they're the perfect pedestal because proportions and anatomical correctness are secondary to being big, green, and angry. I'll start with a lump of aluminium wrapped in a sheet of clay, then I'll attach a couple oversized arms splayed out in an oops I'm dead pose before building up the muscles around his chest and giving him a big fat muscly beer belly and big bulging biceps. The head I'll make by wrapping a little aluminium ball in its own clay covering, then poking some eye sockets and framing a little flat nose. Once I've got that not quite right looking skull, I can attach the oversized bottom jaw and begin to bulk out the cheeks and the cheekbones. I'll then pop some little black eyeballs into my pre-poked eye sockets so I can begin building up the eyelids and cheekbones before finally poking some sniffing holes into the front of his little pig nose and refining the overall shape. I've pre-baked some teeth that I can squish onto that oversized, impressively dimpled jaw before using my ball stylus to add some surface detail. Finally, I can fit a neck onto the back of the head to make attaching it easier, and I'll give this decapitated head a couple appropriately orky looking ears, and he's ready to get pressed onto place on the body. I don't know much about future orc anatomy, but I think they suffer from nerd neck resulting in a head that's always tilted somewhat forward even when they're sleeping or dead. Once I've thickened up the muscles around the neck and shoulders, I'll give the muscles some extra detailing, then move on to making some great big hands. To make space orc hands, I'll start with a big blob of clay and smoosh it into a fingerless mitten into which I'll cut some fingers, then it's just a case of poking, prodding, twisting, and pulling until I've got an appropriately impressive sausage-fingered open fist that I can attach to my outstretched arm. I'll blend the connection point, then repeat this process to make the other hand, then give everything a good smoothing out with a thick coating of isopropyl alcohol. Finally, all that muscle needs some gnarly definition, so I'll make some extremely exaggerated veins by trailing goopy trails of Bacon Bond using a toothpick. Last but not least, I made a little leather strap which will hold his little metal shoulder plate in place. Otherwise, I've now got something for my Space Marine to stand on, but I need something for my orc to lie on. I wanted Bob to be standing with one foot planted on the orc's belly, but I didn't think about how far the orc's arms would reach when I put them splayed out above his head, so I'm going to need to make a substantial base. Fortunately, I've got some thick chunks of XPS foam left over from past projects that I can glue together nicely and then chop up until it resembles a chunk of rocky earth. Of course, if this is rocky earth, then it needs to look rocky, which means it's time for rocks.
Yay, rocks!
With my rock looking like a rock, I wanted to do something to hide the joins in the top of the foam, but rather than cover them up, I figured I could just cut a few more lines into the surface and add lots of cracks to make them look like concrete slabs. I want to make a bunch of concrete walls with various bits of rebar sticking out, so I'll take these blocks of thick XPS foam and snap them down to size. I'll then stab the smooshed up ends of the XPS with lots of little lengths of armature wire that I can then cut into random lengths and stick more little bits of foam onto. These will be my rebar embedded concrete rubble bits, and I'll take some of the larger chunks and smash them up good to make a couple larger chunks to fill in the gaps on the base. I need these larger chunks since my original idea was to have my orc halved with his inside parts sort of falling out. However, my non-platonic roommate asked me ever so nicely to not do that since she hates gore, so instead of noodly intestines, I'm going to cover his missing bottom half in big blocks of foamy concrete. Before I add too much though, I want to make sure the framing is fine for Bob since he's going to be the star of the show, but once he's temporarily in place, I can fill in the rest of the space, cover the remainder of my not disemboweled orc, and sprinkle lots of little chunks of foam everywhere else to make it look like a completely destroyed building. I'll then give the base a thick spritzing of isopropyl alcohol followed by a thinned out PVA glue to lock the foam in place. And to add a bit more texture, I'll sprinkle lots of little rocks and bits of gravel over the entire base. I can then set this aside to cure and get back to painting Bob. Now there's a lot of colorful options when it comes to painting a Space Marine, but I've always been partial to the more muted look of the Dark Angel's blade guards, so I'll start by giving Bob a pale bone white primer. Now with the primer in place, I can set about adding the initial details, starting with his chapter insignia on the shoulder. However, I thought it might be fun to put my channel logo on his shoulder instead. And spoilers, it was not. I started by sketching out the design with a pencil before realizing I have neither the skill nor the patience to freehand an intricate Celtic knot. Next, I thought maybe I could make a stencil, but it would need to be big enough and flexible enough to wrap around the curved pauldron, which led me to try and make one out of clay. Once I'd cut the initial leaf shape out, I realized I needed to add all those little empty sections into the correct places, and my balls began to itch. So instead I scrapped that idea and decided that maybe it would be a little stylized shoulder plate with a raised design instead. To that end, I took the previously removed logo and cut that out of the clay instead. I still had to remove all the little bits, but it's a lot easier to cut these out from the larger design and finesse the fit after. Now, once I've got a kinda shaky looking leaf attached to my pauldron, I can go about cleaning up the cuts while it's attached, as well as adding the loops and swirls that make this leaf a knot. This actually ended up being a lot easier to do with the clay since my painting skills leave a lot to be desired, and having it in 3 dimensions on the clay helps me out. I added the circles around the outside and chopped it up a bit to add a little bit more battle damage, but other than that, we're finally ready to paint. Now, I don't paint Space Marines, but I watch a lot of videos of people that do, and this particular paint scheme is heavily inspired by fellow YouTuber Trovarian, who made a ridiculously cool looking Space Marine at a significantly reduced scale. I've linked their video below, so absolutely go and check that out. For my part though, I started by base coating the body in a weathered bone wash before coming back through with a much lighter bone white to highlight all the larger surfaces and raised sections. By staying away from the edges and recesses, this should give me a nice base that I can then come back to with that first weathered bone wash and repaint the entire body to blend all the tones together. I'll then edge highlight all the edges with a light highlight to add edge highlighting to the edges before getting out my favorite painting tool to add texture and to make the surfaces a little less smooth. I don't much care for painting, but if I have to do it, then I'll almost always choose to use a sponge. I'll start with the darker tones and work my way up through the lighter highlights to give everything a sort of messy textured appearance. Before I add the weathering, I want to paint the logo on the shoulder, so I'll start by painting the blue parts blue and the red parts red. I can edge highlight with black, then add some black into each of the creases of the knots before adding some brighter reds and blues to finish it off. Now, the only thing better than painting with a sponge is adding weathering and battle damage with a sponge. I'll haphazardly sponge a dark graphite along the edges and around the big missing bits of armor. I don't really think you can overdo this part, but if you accidentally go a bit overboard with the damage, you can always sponge the lighter armor tones on top and no one will ever notice. For the spots my sponge can't reach, I'll use a brush. With the brush, I can also flick little bits of graphite outwards as well as create longer chips and cuts as well as join some of the larger chips. Finally, once I've added all the blackish bits, I can apply a bit of natural steel into the deeper grooves where the damage has gone deep enough. Then it's on to painting the noodly black Under Armour, which I'll start by painting with a flat black followed by some dark grays to light gray highlights. To add a bit of color variation, I'll paint the belt with a leather brown and the buckle and Imperialis with a silver. I'll then coat both of these silver bits with a verdigris and rub away the top to leave me with a sorta greenish silver finish. Finally, although it flies in the face of reason, I added a tiny bit of rust around both of these since I thought it looked cool. I know silver doesn't rust, but I like how it looks, and this is a 9-foot tall spaceman with 2 hearts, so I think we can give a bit of room for a rusty silver belt buckle. I'll then paint the silver bits on his helmet silver, as well as do the same for the vents on his backpack. I'll give the chainsaw teeth a couple coats of gunmetal, followed by a silver highlighting, then I can paint the handle with a steel and a bit of sponging will give the blade a sooty metallic finish. Finally, I'll add some silver chipping with the sponge, and I add lots of little nicks and scrapes in silver using my tiniest brush. I'll paint all the metallic bits of the bolter with a silver and steel mix since that's what I had left over in my mixing pot, then I'll give the entire body of the gun a dark red base coat followed by progressively lighter red sponges over top. The entire gun will get lots of weathering with a silver-coated sponge and brushed-on chipping. I can then paint the flying skull gold and paint the banner beige. I wanted something suitably cool for the banner, but couldn't think of anything that wasn't cringe-inducingly edgy, so I just went with North for a little self-promotion. Finally, I'll give every single piece of bob that was painted in metallics a brownish-blackish wash to give it that final, ever-so-important tarnishing. All that's left to do then is paint the eyes red, which I'll do by adding progressively brighter reds towards the center of the eye, ending with a final fluorescent red to make them as glowy as I can. With that, Bob is finally finished and ready for final assembly, and dare I say he's looking like an absolute baller. Except he's perhaps a little too top-heavy. I'd considered giving him a tartan tabard, but decided that would look a little bit too busy, so instead I made him a couple little tactical pouches for his belt and a sweet, heretic-stabbingly big combat knife. Otherwise, Bob is finished, so I just need to finish the base. At this point, the glue is cured, and all it needs is a bit of color. I'll start by priming the base black, followed by a little bit of zenithal highlighting, which is really just blasting white from the top down. I'll give the nameless legless orc a base coating of sick dog green, then completely coat the rocky bits with several coats of gray. The zenithal priming will have only added white to the topmost layer of the base, leaving all the cracks and hidden parts black, so by layering up the grays in thin, translucent coats, I should be able to retain the shading. To add a bit of depth to the brighter spots though, I'll follow the gray top coats with a full soaking in an umber and black wash. Once that's had a chance to dry, I'll dry brush all the stonework with progressively lighter shades of gray, followed by some brownish grayish stippled into the darker sections. The orc is a bit too dark for my taste, so I'll sponge a couple coats of lighter but still very orc-appropriate greens on top to create a much more vibrant skin tone before painting his eyes black with teeny tiny red pupils. Finally, I can paint his mouth with some reds and terracottas before painting his teeth with bone whites, and a sepia wash. All the exposed rebar will get base coated with some metallic steel, followed by a couple coats of rust-colored rust paints. I painted the leather strap leather with little silver bolts, and I gave his shoulder pad a metallic finish with some red sponged over top since red is the fastest color. Finally, I can fit Bob in place triumphant over his enemy, and that's us finally finished and on to the glamour shots.
That was cool. Like, Bob actually came charging to the wall.
Silver, Kristen and Ashley, Charlie Yeaman, Tara, Dewin, Billy Robinson, Lou Bell Mason,
That was
Koi
cool.
Boy, Happy Birthday Scout, The Song.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, if you guys like what you saw and you want to see more, why not hit the follow button, Best Way Sport channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, like what we were just doing with North of the Border, hit the like video. Subscribe while you're at it. And hey, consider also following me on Twitter. And I'll see you guys in the next one.